Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out, and thank you to Stromness Museum for inviting me to give this talk. I thought I ought to start with this first slide about defining my terms, Orkney's offshore dilemmas, and you've been very brave in coming out without having a clue what those dilemmas might be. I mean, I can think of lots that Orkney faces with its offshore location. It might be ferries, it might be coast protection, it might be the fisheries, all sorts of things. The one I want to draw out is how Orkney and areas like Orkney can win value from these new activities that we're talking about, whether it be renewables, whether it be aquaculture, whether it be other maritime industries which are on the horizon. How does Orkney win value from that for the community? The immediate answer is with difficulty. But I just want to explore that to look at some of the recent history of renewables and then at what the various authorities around Scotland are saying in the policies that they're setting to try and get some of this value. So that's the purpose of the talk. Someone's already asked me this evening where that is. Anyone know where that is? It's a trick question because I have to say it's an unfair question because that is Shetland. And I took that photograph just 2-3 weeks ago when we had that lovely weather. And that's Danup, Danos, not Nos Island, but there's a little settlement called Nos in the south end, very close to where my family have a house. And I just liked the picture, but also liked what it exhibited that I wanted to pick up in the talk. And that is the nature of the edge that sometimes talk about Orkney and Shetland being on the edge, but they like to think they're at the center of something, and indeed they are. It's not that edge I'm talking about. It's the very stark difference between land and sea. But once you step over that tide line, everything changes. Absolutely everything. You're in a different physical environment, you're in a different legal environment, you're in a different social environment, you're in a different cultural environment. So if the activities of the future industries for Orkney and other islands like Shetland are going to involve maritime activities, then clearly the community here wants some of that value. What I want to pick up on is some of the instruments that have started to be developed to pick up elements of that value and some that have been picked up in the past. Once we get into the marine environment, we're in a very difficult legal and management framework, which is quite frankly chaotic. It's you step over that tide line and you leave domestic law and you're straight into the area of international law, even in the territorial sea, where it's almost full sovereignty for those 12 miles, but not quite. You still have to allow innocent passage of vessels through your territorial sea. And once you get to the exclusive economic zone, then you're even more in international territory because they're not British waters, they're international waters. But we, as the coastal state, have the rights to the resources, the seabed and the marine resources, but we don't have a right to the waters themselves. And so we have all sorts of treaties. We have the Law of the Sea Convention from the 1980s. We have the Climate Convention. We have the Biodiversity Convention. We now have the High Seas Convention. So this management and the legal framework is in the hands of international bodies like IMO for shipping, International Maritime Organization, like the Seabed Authority for use of the seabed in the high seas. But we've seen what's happened in the last few years about treaties. We've all started pulling out of treaties, including us, and certainly the United States has. It's always been reluctant even to enter them. It hasn't yet ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, which came into force in 1997. So we're in a difficult legal framework and a difficult ownership framework. Who is going to benefit from any industry that takes place, first of all, in the territorial sea, and then in the exclusive economic zone, and then in the high seas? Once you're in the high seas, the United Nations statement is that the resources there are for the benefits of mankind, but we haven't harvested very much yet. And there are certain countries like the United States who feel that should not apply to them. So it's a difficult area. More recent history. So we're working over the last 10 years, perhaps, where the European Union has taken a very close interest in blue growth. The Blue Growth Agenda of 2008 named the areas where they look for growth in energy, particularly renewable energy, in seabed mining, in aquaculture, in bioengineering, and also to grow what exists in the economy, like tourism, shipping, oil and gas, and fisheries. And you can see how many of those activities concern Orkney and the islands around Scotland. Perhaps not seabed mining, and perhaps not the bioengineering or the biotechnology, but all the others either affect Orkney now or have affected Orkney in the past. And once we've come over that edge, the community of Orkney has very little say in the jurisdiction and the management of what's happening just off their coast. There have been a couple of small inroads into winning something back. We've talked in the past, and most people know of the oil and gas arrangements, whereby Orkney and Shetland were able to negotiate a share of the revenues from oil and gas in return for giving land over to terminals and providing harbour services, essentially harbour acts. They gave harbour powers, which enabled both islands to do reasonably well out of that. Not as well as some. The Alaska fields they got more money from ESSO than we did from the consortium around the North Sea. But nonetheless, there was reasonable income coming through from that, and we both have, when I say both, I'm talking Orkney and Shetland, have reserve funds which have built up over the years, earning money, they're invested, and they allow us to spend on projects which benefit the community. The other small inroad was with aquaculture, where more for lack of anyone else to do it, the government arranged for the local authorities in Scotland to be the planning authority for aquaculture out to 3 miles, but only 3 miles. And aquaculture is now moving out into much deeper waters and has plans to move further offshore. But apart from that, Orkney has no planning powers. It is a statutory consultee on plans, and it does draft the local regional MSP, Marine Spatial Plan, for the government, but they don't make the decisions. They can make a draft, but it's up to the minister to approve it and to manage it. I won't come up with too many stats and graphs, but two I like. And these come from an OECD report from 2016, which looked at growth in the marine economy from 2010 through to 2030. In 2010, it was worth about $3 trillion, and it was forecast to double by 2030. This one here is a share of that value, gross value added, which is dominated by oil and gas and also by tourism. Then the shares of the values drop off and they're spread out over these several activities, with offshore wind just coming in 2010 at the end there, and having a lot of growth, but still not a massive share of value by 2010. The blue is 2010, and the grey is 2030. So by 2030, it's certainly grown. By that time, we've seen tourism overtake oil and gas, which is on the decline, but they're still the two dominant activities, oil and gas and tourism. You see a different picture if you look at that by employment. It's turned around completely, because if you looked at catch fisheries on the share of value, it's well down. It's quite tiny. If you look at catch fisheries by employment, it outstrips everything else. And it's what makes fisheries so politically sensitive, both in Orkney and around the shores of Scotland. If you actually add in, these are industrial catch fisheries, if you actually add in what you might term subsistence or artisanal fisheries, then employment around the globe is probably around about 40 million involved in fish. So very briefly, the complexities of Scottish maritime jurisdiction. The dark blue is the 12-mile territorial sea, where we have this nearly full sovereignty, but not quite. The light blue is the exclusive economic zone. But it's doubly complicated in Scotland because it's also the devolution settlement changes by activity. So that you've got some activities there which are still held by Westminster, telecoms, oil and gas, and shipping. The dark green ones are the responsibility of Holyrood, and the light green ones are the responsibility of Westminster, but by agreement they're managed, executively devolved to Scotland. So it's quite a complex picture. And the blue dot, which interests us perhaps there, the one just to the west of Orkney is Salisbury, and then you've got North Uist alongside that. These two, Rockall and St Kilda, Rockall in particular, it does not actually, it gets a 12-mile territorial sea around it, but as an uninhabited rock, it doesn't gain anything in the exclusive economic zone. So the exclusive economic zone stops just the other side of it, measured from the Scottish coastline. So the jurisdiction is complicated. And if we go back now to, this is 2009, many will be very, very familiar with this drawing, which I haven't seen for some time, and I've pulled it out again because it fell off the sort of things to do list. This is the Crown Estate in 2009 published the award of option leases for sites for wave energy and tidal energy. The wave there shown in green and the tidal site shown there in orange. It was an interesting time, 2009, 2010, because this created a lot of excitement in Orkney. I remember the first exhibitions at the King Street halls, which were packed out with people who wanted to know what it was about and what these devices were going to do and what the devices looked like. But the Crown Estate at that time lacked some of the experience they've since gained in how to liaise with communities on proposals of this size immediately adjacent to the shore. And it exposed a lot of ignorance about where people actually fish, for example. As when the inshore fisheries are concerned, the non-quota fisheries, it was not known. And I remember going to one of the first consultations at the Kirkwall Hotel when the poor Crown Estate people turned up and were faced by about 100 angry fishermen. And it was a really good meeting because everyone was so angry, it was interesting. You know, this had really come out of the woodwork, and it was a consultation that meant something. They still needed to get licenses and permissions to develop. But there were optimistic noises about bringing 2 gigawatts of wave and tidal power into commission by 2020. Many of you remember devices like these. These were technologies that worked and were brought up here on test. And there's Polaris, there's Open Hydro, and there's Oyster. all near to shore devices, but in the end, there wasn't the money. They were too expensive for the amount of power they produced. And all three of these technologies, which were probably the leading technologies of the time in these two disciplines, they went bust. And it was then that offshore wind started to grow, particularly in England, and attention moved to offshore wind with its fairly simple technology, and the price for power generated by offshore wind turbines fell quite dramatically. At the same time, marine spatial planning came on the scene, really from the early 2000s. The European Union and some European governments were looking at bringing in means to plan the sea. No one had planned the sea before. There'd been no planning control as such. So they introduced this concept of marine spatial planning, which in Scotland came into legislation in 2010 with the Marine Scotland Act, which gave the minister powers to draw up a national marine spatial plan and regional marine spatial plans drafted by marine planning partnerships. The idea was that it would get closer to the community with 11 regions around Scotland, one of which was Orkney. But this pilot plan, which is one of the first things I got involved with when I came back to Heriot-Watt, when I came home from overseas, was designed to test the legislation, the 2010 legislation, the Marine Scotland Act, and it covered an area greater than Orkney itself. So this is pretty much the territorial sea around Orkney, north of Caithness, and the area around Salisbury, which has a territorial sea but does not extend the exclusive economic zone. What that did for Orkney, that exercise with wave and tidal power, it put Orkney on the map for renewables. Partly, I think, Heriot-Watt played a role in that, in early work on renewables around about 2000. It brought EMEC to Orkney. It created companies like Exodus and Aquaterra, who came and set up in Orkney. They're now still here, a lot of people employed there. It created companies like Green Marine, who became very adept at handling these devices, and since gone on to be very big on the offshore wind fields around Scotland and elsewhere. So it did create a centre of gravity for Orkney. And I think the fact that those devices were so close to shore, and the oyster devices particularly, we can run right up the west coast, created a fair bit of opposition as well. So a need for planning, but it put them anyway at the centre of gravity. Because there were impacts. The impacts were there, and Orkney had a good case to negotiate a return for that. This was close to shore, it affected the community, it affected the fisheries in particular, it affected tourism and the viewpoints up and down the coast, it affected the environment. So there was quite high impact from those proposals, which would have enabled Orkney to negotiate, perhaps as they negotiated with the oil companies when the oil came ashore, some kind of return for that impact. But that didn't happen, and it went away, or those particular devices went away. And what we've had much more recently is ScotWind, which is the Scottish sectoral plan for offshore wind energy, which was published in October 2020. It was the latest in a long line of proposals. They've been producing sectoral plans. This is the government producing sectoral plans over some years. And they eventually came to this proposal, which is one of the only marine plans I'm aware of almost globally. I dare say there are some, but I don't know them, which actually has cast iron proposals for development. The earlier work on marine spatial plans found themselves bogged down in policy without being able to assign particular activities particular space, because no one knew what those activities were going to be. What were the companies, the aquaculture companies, come forward with? What were the wave companies come forward with? So there were no actual firm development proposals beyond those which the Crown Estate put out in 2009. But this is a firm development plan, which is active. And they went on from here to allow Crown Estate to issue invitations to companies to tender for the rights, the option lease rights to particular sites within these areas. So what the government has done, which I think is quite impressive, is to research the whole of the Scottish waters to see where one might be able to put large installations like this, huge areas of sea covered by this. And they undertook a strategic environmental assessment of these areas, and they consulted on these areas. So they were then able to give these areas to the market, the government having decided where the most suitable areas would be for these kinds of very large developments. The two which are of most interest to Orkney are the west of Orkney wind farm, which you can see just off the west coast there, and Thistle just off the east coast. But they're quite a long way away. They're about 30 kilometres from Orkney, about 28 kilometres north of Caithness. The west of Orkney one is. And the west of Orkney one is a good one to look at because it's the most advanced of all the proposals that have come forward. And the government won tenders for all the areas. So all the areas now have companies working within them or intending to work within them to develop offshore wind farms. The west of Orkney one is interesting as well. I'm not quite sure. I haven't been able to plan it out exactly how much of it appears within the Salisbury territorial sea and how much is in the bit of exclusive economic zone between the two. Because Salisbury is administratively part of Orkney, but of course nobody lives there. So that would be Orkney territorial sea if the turbines were in that area. But I think most of them, the AI answer I got was that it's all in the exclusive economic zone. So they've squeezed it in between the two territorial sea limits, or the main part of it. But when it comes down to impacts, these are the cable proposals. And Orkney doesn't feature very strongly at all in these developments. Now, there are very few direct impacts on Orkney. We have the new cable coming in at the moment, which SSE are putting in, coming ashore at Warburth, which is designed to take onshore power from Orkney into the grid, with some capacity for expansion of that. But the offshore facilities are going either direct to Caithness, the west of Orkney wind farm, or they're going directly into the Moray Firth, which is Thistle. So it looks to me as if Orkney have less of a negotiating base to say we want some of that value. I hear it talked about as being part of Orkney, but in actual fact, the actual impact will be quite small unless we get things like a turbine development base. But that would just be bringing employment and vessels into Orkney's harbours. Big ones up in Shetland. It's interesting to see the Shetland cable coming all the way down there, but bypassing Orkney. Part of the west of Orkney wind farm case for the tender was that they might bring power into Flotter and have Flotter repurposed for the production of hydrogen. It seemed very much, I don't know, Neil, what you know about that, but it looks very much on the back burner if it's ever going to happen. So Orkney's case is much smaller as far as this offshore wind is concerned. just a little digression towards Malta. There was, some of you'll know about the Carbon Neutral Islands program run by Francesco Sindico on behalf of the Scottish government. And as well as the Scottish islands that is working on, they took quite a lot, or Francesco in particular, took quite a lot of sort of cooperation with islands elsewhere. Malta in particular, and the Solomon Islands, strangely, in particular. And the Maltese came to the Scottish government and said, look, we don't have an offshore wind program. We don't have a policy towards offshore wind, but we'd like to learn, and asked some questions of the Scottish government to help them as part of the CNI program. And the Scottish government came to us at Heriot-Watt and said, would we make that report? And that went in a couple of years ago now, Sandy, wasn't it? I think we did the final report in October 23 down in London. Now, as far as the regulation and planning is concerned, I think we've covered a lot of that. Scotland has developed this national marine plan, is working on the regional marine plans, and has a licensing system to allow these big developments to take place once all the environmental impact assessments have been gone through and the consultations have been gone through. So there is a whole process there which is up and working. The leasing side of things, Crown Estate have gained a lot of experience in how to lease these very large areas of seabed for big industrial activities. And they have a pretty sophisticated way through that now, with option leases converted to full leases, with the definition of how much that is going to cost, both in rents and in a share of production. The business side of things is interesting. The way these businesses, these offshore wind businesses, have started to work, where the money comes from and where the benefits go. And it's the community benefit side of things, which I think is our main interest, that Orkney and other coastal communities should be able to gain some community benefit from all these activities now, which, at one time the sea was just there as something strange and only the fishermen went out on it and the odd ferry and vessel. But now it's becoming an industrial base, and that Orkney looks out on all this industry taking place around it. And it seems only fair that Orkney should both benefit from that and have some environmental control of that, rather than it just being handed over to the government to do it. And I think, well, we'll come to it in a moment, but I think most of the Scottish authorities have started to develop policies towards that, although they're pretty divergent in what they're asking for and the way they might tackle it. It'd be great to see them working together a bit more strongly. So if we look at the business side of things, and we looked at west of Orkney Wind Farm in particular, because there were some interesting things about it. But if we look to the wind companies, there's an awful lot of government involvement in those companies at every level. A lot of the big ones, EDF, Vattenfall, ESB, Ørsted, Equinor, these are the companies you will have heard of and reported back as these big wind farm owners are either wholly government-owned or partially government-owned. Then we have the PLCs, the big PLCs like SSE, who are very big here, Total, which is an integrated engineering company, and the German company. And then we also have, which are the new ones, which interest me, which are the asset management companies coming in. And we see them particularly in west of Scotland. This is the shareholding for the west of Orkney Wind Farm, where Macquarie have the biggest shareholding. I don't know how many of you know about Macquarie. Ever heard of Macquarie? They're big influence on our lives now, huge. They specialize in asset management of infrastructure. They're private equity companies. They look to move money around and make a return on the money by passing over the risk to other people, one way or another. They were an Australian bank, but they become global and very big in financing infrastructure projects, including offshore wind. They're getting quite big in offshore wind. Come back to them in a second. Total Energy is obviously an oil company, but they describe themselves as an integrated energy company, and they're the second biggest shareholder. And then there's the RIGD Group, a Scottish development company with a smaller shareholding. And then some local companies of partners. Exodus, we know very well, who had the job of doing the environmental impact assessment. And then some marine contractors, consultants, lawyers, very important to have lawyers in the mix. And then Siemens Energy, who are the turbine designer and supplier. And just going back to that one for the moment, the other asset management company, which you may have heard of, BlackRock, United States company. The shareholding there was the shareholding at the time of award. Macquarie have since farmed off the Western Orkney wind farm down at least 3 or 4 stages, remote from them. Each stage removes some risk from the holding company, passes it over to other particular project companies. So they passed it off to the Green Investment Group, which is Edinburgh-based investment company owned by Macquarie. They passed it off to Corio as the shareholder. And then they have holding companies who are actually putting in the money. And so far, West of Orkney Wind Farm has just been licensed by Marine Scotland. So they did their EIA. They've got their license to develop. The next stage will be construction when the big money starts. And you're looking at a development of around about £4 billion for West of Orkney, which is a frightening sum of money. Those companies are already in it. They haven't done any work yet, apart from upfront work. They've already funded to the extent of £200 million has gone in before they even got a license. And they might not have got a license. So there's a lot of at-risk money there. And the holding companies, both the Total and Macquarie's holding companies, have put in that money at an interest rate of 12%, which reflects the risk. So that money will be wrapped up in losses for West of Orkney until the big funds come in. And the other feature of an offshore wind farm, as opposed to, say, a combined cycle gas turbine power station, is that investment has to go in before a penny of revenue is earned. If you're building a conventional power station, then most of the money is in buying the gas over perhaps 30 years' life. And the actual capital needed to get it off the ground is a fraction of that. And combined cycle gas turbines are very easy to build, take up half a football pitch, and could be up and running within a year. So you have a lot of difficulties to overcome in the argument for renewables and the argument for offshore wind. We all know we have to go there, but they're up against some pretty stiff opposition from a much easier solution, as long as gas is available and being produced. A Shetland story. I was up in Shetland for a month recently, and I was quite surprised to see the vehemence of this report in the Shetland Times of about a month ago. They just had what they call the scoping consultation from the 2 companies involved up there, which is Ocean Winds with Arvin and ESB with Stura, which are proposals for nearly 3 gigawatts of power, which will come down that cable we looked at on the cable drawing. And they just had the scoping consultation. And Shetland Times really laid into them. Not only did they with this leader, but also with 2 whole pages of other interested parties, councillors, residents, what have you. And I was interested to understand why the vehemence of this objection. Because this area, the NE1 area, or northeast area, with these two companies in is a long way offshore Shetland. It's about 30 kilometres off. So it's outside the territorial sea. I think the conclusions are that Shetland communities are badly bruised by the Viking wind farm affair. There's a strong feeling in the islands that they've sold their birthright for a mess of pottage. And a lot of the objections which came after this consultation was a complete lack of community benefit details as to how much the islands were actually going to get back. To take the power from this, they need a massive 3 gigawatt capacity cable down to Murray Firth. The existing cable, which was put in for Viking, is about 750 megawatts. They've built 500, and there's 250 out for licensing at the moment in North Maveen, so going north. And there's a real fear amongst Shetland people that the whole island is going to be covered with these extremely large turbines. I mean, way outside anything that's happened in Orkney. These are 4.3 megawatt turbines, which for land-based farms is huge. One time that would have just been offshore. Okay, offshore now we're up 16, going on 20. A real concern up there and a huge objection, both with west of Orkney and with Thistle. I don't think there was a murmur in Orkney. I didn't hear a murmur of objection to either of those two wind farms. Whether that's because we've become used to these consultations, we know what it's about because renewables have been such a big topic of conversation here now for at least 15 years. But there in Shetland, there was this huge anti-feeling. And the councils have come up. I looked at this. This was a report by Equitable Energy Research. I think a lot of you here will know Tom Wills. I think he worked down here Neil at one time. And he set up this company, Equitable Energy Research, and they've reported on social benefit of offshore wind farms. And this is an extract from one of their findings, which went around the country looking at how the various councils are approaching what they might ask for from offshore wind if they have the negotiating capacity to do it. And that's the big question. Is one thing to ask for it. It's another thing having some kind of capacity to negotiate a rightful return. And all of them pretty much look for a minimum of £5,000 per megawatt installed per annum. And that is a figure that's been set now since 2010 for onshore wind farms, but is not written into any code for offshore. It's not even compulsory for onshore, but it's become the standard thing to do. It's part of the costs of developing an onshore wind farm, is that that amount of money will go to the local communities. The next one is interesting because this is the Shetland proposal. Shetland says no. What we want is a community benefit payment, a CBP, as a percentage of gross project revenue. Gross project revenue, mind you, not a share of profits. A share of gross project revenue with a minimum of 5,000 per megawatt per annum. And they've staged it. They said we want 2.5% for offshore wind farms and 5% for onshore wind farms. So at 5% of gross project revenue, that would more than double the amount of money they're getting from Viking at the moment. As far as the offshore is concerned, it wouldn't make that much difference. I think I worked out it would go from 10 million a year to 11 million a year on a GPR basis of 2.5%. But they're the most aggressive in what they're asking for. The interesting part of the report also went on to say that it's only Orkney who's gone for municipal ownership of onshore wind farms. And then there are demands for discounted electricity, which I think would be the most popular feature around the islands. And then some have come up with a community wealth strategy, but is less well defined, and a social value framework. But every council is slightly different, with Shetland being the most aggressive in the demand. And they, to be fair, they will have a big impact because the power from Arwen and Stura goes ashore on Shetland before it's then resent down the line to the Murray Firth and the grid. And we can see now the construction works at Finstown, which you don't really see unless you come down the road from Evie. And then you can see in the valley the size of what's being built at Finstown. If you imagine the same thing for a much larger cable coming down from Shetland, it will be a very big construction operation. So that's it. There I am back in Shetland on Danube on a beautiful day. For Orkney, there's this question, first of all, of what impact and what negotiating position. Shetland, I think, has got a good negotiating position. Will that apply to all authorities or just to them? And how do they do it? Do they go, within the Shetland Times feature articles, one of them was headlined, "Only autonomy will give us the result we want." It's an old chestnut, comes up in Orkney and Shetland from time to time. As more of our economy in Orkney and more of our economy in Shetland moves from the land out into the sea, isn't it right that our locally elected representatives have a say over what happens where and how it's controlled, rather than it just being central? So, I don't know, for local politicians, it's a brave move. And who wants to be brave when you're a politician? But that looks to be the only route that would really sort once for all this question of return and benefit and development at sea. Thank you.